All right, so our learning target today is that students will be able to divide fractions using bar models. So we're going to use the algorithm, but we're not going to start that today because we want students to know where all of this comes from. So it's a little bit different on how we do it, and it's not going to be anything that you've ever seen before. Looking at example A, it says Lee cut 2 pies into pieces that were 1/4 of a pie. How many pieces did Lee cut the 2 pies into? So we started with 2 pies and we're dividing them into pieces that are 1/4 of a pie. And we want to know how many pieces did Lee cut the pie into. So looking at this, the math behind it is I'm going to take 2 and I'm going to divide it by 1/4. So I have my 2 wholes, and I would have drawn those first, and I'm breaking it into whatever the denominator says. So I'm breaking it into 1/4 pieces, and I can actually just count how many groups of 1/4. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And this is kind of a really straightforward example because I'm only taking 1 piece of the pie at a time. So if I take 2 and I divide it into fourths, I end up with 8 pieces. So that one's a pretty straightforward example. It gets a little bit trickier than that as we go. And so I'm going to move into one that's a little bit different. So looking at this one, we start with 5 holes. So we started with, in this case, 5 circles. And we are dividing them. We want to put them in groups of 2/3. So what you need to remember is that the 3 is, or your denominator, is how many parts I'm going to break each hole into. So I take all 5 and I break them into thirds. Now this is where it gets a little tricky. If I was baking a batch of cookies, let's say I had 5 cups of flour and each batch took 2/3 of a cup. I want to know how many batches can I make. So if I'm looking at this, each batch is going to take 2/3. So this is 1/3, and I'm going to change out to black so you can see a little bit better. So this is 1/3, this is 2/3. So that's my first batch of cookies. This is 1/3. I'm not going to throw away this piece. I'm going to combine it over here with 1/3 from here. Now I can make 2 batches of cookies. 1/3, 2/3. I can make 3 batches. 1/3, 2/3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I can make, if I have 5 cups of flour and each recipe calls for 2/3 of a cup, I can make 7 whole batches. Now this is where it gets tricky. We have this one leftover piece, and it took me quite a while looking at these examples to figure out how they came up with this fraction piece. But what you need to think about is how many thirds did it take to make a batch? And I can see in every case it took 2/3. And I have 1/3. So if I took this and I added 1 more third, then I could make another batch. So I have 1 out of 2 that I need to make it. So what a lot of students want to do is grab this denominator here and use it over here, but really it's how many thirds do I have out of how many thirds I need? And I had 1 out of 2/3. If I had both of these pieces, I could make my 8th batch, but I only have half of what I needed. And that's where that 7.5 comes from. Looking at the next one, if I start with 9 and let's say I have 9 cups of flour, we'll stick with the same example. We have 9 cups of flour and each recipe calls for 3/8 of a cup. I want to know how many recipes I can make. So I'm going to show this one a little bit different just based on the bars that we're starting with. So if I start with 9 wholes and I want to break them into groups of 3/8, what we did was we took 9 whole bars, and it doesn't matter if you do circles or rectangles or what you do, as long as you break it into the correct number of pieces. So every hole, all 9 whole bars were broken into 8s. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 8 equal pieces. Each piece represents 1/8. We need to group them or take them 3/8 at a time. And so the way I'm going to show it this time is I'm going to group them like this, and that's one group, so that's one recipe. This is 2. I'm not going to throw those 2 pieces away. I'm just going to come over here, and just because it's easier, I'm going to group it with this 1/8 over here. So 3 recipes or batches, 4, 5. Now I'm going to come around and I'm going to share these. So these 3 are going to go together. That's going to make 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'll share these over here. That's going to be group 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, and 24. So this one I didn't have any remaining. So I put them in groups of 3. And so if I take 9 and I divide it by 3/8, I end up with 24 batches of cookies that I could make. Let's pretend I had 1/8 sitting over here and I had 1 left over. If I had 1 left over, my answer would be 24 full batches. And I think about what would make another batch. So I can just draw in these dashed lines here. I know that I need 3/8 to make another batch, and I only have 1/8.